He's no longer a good fit. According to a report by the Education Law Center, those were the words uttered by the director of an early childhood program in Pennsylvania in reference to a 2-year-old black boy with autism. The director uttered those words shortly after the child started attending the program, after his mother made the director aware of her son's autism, and after reassuring the child's mother that her son would be fine. According to the report, when meeting with the child's mother to inform her of her child's expulsion, there were, quote, no solutions offered, no supports discussed, no conversation about what could be done differently. The child's mother was told the decision was final and her son would not be allowed to return. This is a practice that the child's mother now understands was discriminatory. However, it's not unique. In fact, it has a name. Preschool Pushout. It's an illegal practice that lives at the intersection of racism and ableism. Nearly 50% of public school preschool suspensions are black children, despite only representing 20% of public school preschool students. Disabled children are suspended at 14.5 times the rate of their non-disabled peers. Preschool Pushout is an intentional effort to exclude based on race and ability status. Preschool Pushout is eugenics. Welcome to She Really Gets It, a public health podcast. I'm Stephanie Rhodes, a Black woman, public health professional, and your guide to understanding how policies, institutions, and the systems that uphold them harm the public's health, but also how people are coming together to repair that harm and change the system. When I initially started conducting research for this episode, I intended for it to simply result in an episode on racism and ableism in education. But what I discovered was something much more insidious. I discovered a story about erasure of those that some of the foremost institutions of higher learning have deemed necessary, but expendable. Necessary, but only in contrast to those who have been deemed worthy of an education, worthy of freedom, worthy of life. In December of 2015, now deceased Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia stated during the court's hearing on an affirmative action case that, quote, there are those who contend that it does not benefit African Americans to get them into the University of Texas where they do not do well, as opposed to having them go to a less advanced school, a slower track school where they do well. End quote. But where did Justice Scalia even form this idea that Black people specifically should be at slower track schools? I mean, the University of Texas is, after all, a public university. Where did he get the idea that the public should be excluded from receiving an education there based on skin color? Perhaps it was his education. You see, Justice Antonin Scalia graduated from Harvard Law School in 1960, and that is where we will begin our story. But we will go back in time to 1869 with the help of Harvard's first Black woman tenured professor and trailblazing civil rights attorney, Lani Guinier. In her 2015 book, The Tyranny of the Meritocracy, Professor Guinier describes how in 1869, Harvard's new president, Charles William Eliot, found himself so, quote, annoyed by the stupid sons of the rich that he decided to do something quite revolutionary for a Harvard man, that is. He decided it was time to admit students to Harvard based on intelligence as opposed to lineage, and to remove means as a barrier. He did this by replacing the then traditional Greek admissions exam with the exams created by the College Entrance Examination Board. This change tripled the number of testing locations. Prior to these changes, the extremely privileged applicant pool would take subject-based exams administered by the Ivy League school they wished to be admitted to. They could take the exams as many times as they wished, and in fact, they could actually fail and still be admitted to their school of choice with, quote, conditions. That's right. When the price of admission to Harvard was the right bloodline and New England private boarding school attendance, Admission was guaranteed and testing was just a formality. And therein lies the problem. The value of a Harvard degree lay in its exclusivity, not its academic rigor. And to be clear, once a young man was formally enrolled at Harvard, Princeton, or Yale, his focus was on his social life, not his academic work. Now back to the book that I am and will be referencing throughout today's episode. It's called The Tyranny of the Meritocracy, and its author is Lani Guinier, and it was published in 2015. I say this to ensure it is not confused with another book titled The Tyranny of Merit, written by Michael J. Sandel and published 5 years later in 2020. You see, Michael Sandel, a white man, also, like Professor Guinier, happens to be a tenured professor at Harvard Law School. And I'm sure the almost identical titles were just a coincidence, and Mr. Sandel was not attempting to erase the scholarly work of his colleague, the first Black woman appointed to a tenured professorship at Harvard. That would be a bit too on the nose, right? Right? It's not like Harvard has a documented history of hiring, then lampooning and erasing the scholarship of Black women that dare accept employment there. Now back to only needing the right pedigree, white, wealthy, male, New England boarding school, to get into the most recognizable, prestigious university in North America. Well, you see, once poor white men, Catholic white men, Jewish white men, public school white men started outperforming the traditional WASP applicant pool, a panic set in because, as I said before, Harvard's prestige lay not in its academic rigor, but its exclusivity. And once those outside the exclusive group could not only get in, but excel, that became a threat to Harvard's identity. So what did they do? They changed the admissions process. Suddenly, the Harvard admissions application required a picture, recommendation letters, and evidence of participation in extracurricular activities. This new application allowed Harvard to measure an applicant's social desirability. The, quote, well-rounded applicant was born, but it didn't stop there. They needed a test that would, quote, separate the wheat from the chaff, and that test was the SAT. The SAT was created by celebrated eugenicist Carl Brigham. For those that are unaware, eugenicists are white supremacists that believe in supporting the mass production of white people they deem to have desirable traits. And that's not an exaggeration. They legit support prenatal care, but for whites only, while at the same time supporting the sterilization, containment, and murder of those they believe to have undesirable traits, including white people they believe to have undesirable traits. For example, poor white people and, of course, disabled white people. Eugenicists consider all Native Americans, Black people, and all disabled people to be undesirable. So Carl Brigham, the eugenicist, was a Princeton graduate who also attended Harvard, and he developed the SAT from an IQ test that was already being utilized in the U.S. military to determine which soldiers were suitable to become officers. That IQ test, the Army IQ test, was developed by another known and celebrated eugenicist named Robert Yerkes. And what do you know? The results of both of their tests were reflective of their own prejudices, their own eugenicist principles. White people scored higher than Black people. Native-born white people scored higher than foreign-born white people. And the rich scored higher than the poor. This is because the tests were simply tests of acculturation. For example, a sample question for the Yerkes Army Intelligence Test was, quote, Velvet Joe appears in advertisements of A, tooth powder, B, dry goods, C, tobacco, or D, soap. That's a quiz bowl question. That's a question of acculturation. And that's all the SAT was designed to detect. Not intelligence, acculturation. It's you can't sit with us in test form. This singular exam would go on to become the premier exam utilized by every U.S. institution to determine who belonged and who didn't. A test created by supremacists, reflective of nothing more than their own biases, but truly reflective of the true values of the most prestigious institutions in the United States. The admission standards of Harvard did not stay contained to Harvard or just the big three. It spread like a cancer to every institute of education. You will find it in every school of public health, social work, medicine. Hell, it's the secret sauce behind healthcare provider bias. We can see it reflected in the case of the preschool mentioned at the beginning of the program. It is reflected there because it was celebrated as the model for education then and now. We can see it in preschool Pushout, where Black children and disabled children are far more likely to be expelled from preschool than any other group. This society does not deem them worthy of an education because the educational institutions that we hold in the highest regard abide by the ethical framework of literal eugenicists. And in 2026, do not deem Black children, Latino children, and children with disabilities worthy of an education. And we celebrate those institutions. We teach our children to aspire to Harvard, to Princeton, to Yale, to aspire to exclusion, to aspire to enslave and dominate those that have been deemed unworthy. And the goals are clear if we just look at the data. Preschool Pushout is a precursor to incarceration. That is a fact. It's called the pre-K to prison pipeline. Because what is an education if not freedom? If it wasn't freedom, it wouldn't have been denied to the victims of chattel slavery in the United States. Because the United States, to be clear, is a slave economy and can only thrive if someone isn't being paid for their labor. It is, in fact, the only country to have ever had explicit anti-literacy laws for a reason. Learning to read was and is freedom. For the victims of chattel slavery, it was a threat to those who sought to hold them captive. It's a threat to those who seek to hold us captive now. I'll end with this. We, the people, have the power. We have elevated these institutions. We were propagandized into elevating these institutions. But then again, knowledge truly is power. We now know better, and we can choose to do better. If you would like to learn more about the myth of merit in education, I invite you to either purchase The Tyranny of the Meritocracy by Lonnie Guinier or borrow a copy from your local library. I will include links to the book in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode of She Really Gets It, please review and rate this podcast via Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. It really helps people find the show. If you have any topics you believe we should explore on future episodes, you can join my Substack and reply to any of the emails I send out. Links to that will also be in the show notes.